I can pinpoint the very instant that I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I was no longer cool. Now, I know what you're thinking. How can that be, Eric? You were never cool. And actually, that moment, I think, taught me that as well. So here's what was happening. It was a Sunday after church. Church had done great. I was a fairly new priest. I was living in Kansas City, and we had a beautiful day. Now, I know that doesn't sound like much, but in Kansas City, you almost never have a good weather day. It's 0 degrees in the winter, 100 degrees in the summer, and somehow we landed on 75. And it was beautiful, and I had the windows down in my car. I was feeling great, and this song came on, and it was a pop song. I'm too embarrassed to even tell you what it was, but I was singing along to the top of my lungs, windows down, nobody in the car, nobody around, or so I thought, because driving beside me were two 20-something guys who were actually cool. And they were getting a great bit of entertainment watching this priest sing a Justin Timberlake song at the top of my lungs. And I didn't know that they were there, of course, until I stopped at a light, and I turned around, and there they were, looking really cool, and all they did was wave at me. And then right then, in that moment, I knew that I was no longer cool. I guess that's a good assumption that one has about themselves that needs to be undone. You know, there's nothing worse than middle-aged men, now I'm 47, walking around thinking I'm cool. That would embarrass my children, and so it's good that I got it out of the way. Assumptions in life are like that. They sometimes need to be undone. They can, in this sort of situation, just kind of be silly and frivolous. And yet we know some assumptions, if we have them, can also be quite dangerous if they're not undermined or are dismantled. It's good in our lives to discover the truth, even when that truth comes as most unexpected. Now, you've heard us say, I hope, that the season that we're in, Epiphany, is a season of revelation and discovery. It's what the word itself means, a manifestation, a discovery, and a disclosure. And really what it's aiming at is, who is this child that has been born at Christmas? Who is this man that this child becomes? And what is the implications of his life for the world about us and us within it? And while all of that is generally positive, a lot of what we're discovering in the Jesus event is that the assumptions that we have had about God, where God acts, how God interacts, and what God wants from us are all being undermined. And it's a good thing, although it can be destabilizing. And maybe the first of these assumptions that is undone is that God is remote, and that God wants to be unknown, that God's hanging out in heaven and doesn't want any interaction with the world that we live in. And yet, in the Jesus event, the coming of God in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, what we find is that what we actually have is not a God who is removed from the world, but a God who rather shows up and steps into the very real world in which we live. A God who comes to us and wants to be known in our world. Now, we oftentimes think of God in a different way. Even our God language that we use as often discloses that reality. We say, well, I'm on a search for God. I'm on a search for God. And then I guess at some time later we'll say something like, I found God. Like God was lost. Or God was Waldo or something. I found him finally. There he is. He's very elusive. And yet, like with all of our efforts, God, we're saying it almost that if we hadn't searched out and found God, that God would not have happened in our world and in our lives. And yet I want to suggest that saying such a thing as that is kind of like the rooster saying that without him the sun wouldn't have come out. Now, I'm not trying to deny that we people are people who are often searching. Indeed, we human beings are very much, almost always, on a search. We long to find truth. We long to be truthfully found. In college, I certainly noticed this. You walk by a classroom, had a notice on the door of a lecture going on, My 5 Years with a Zen Master, and you look in, and all these people are sitting there in rapt attention, nodding their heads in agreement at everything that's being said. 2 days later, you go by this exact same classroom, another notice, My Semester in a Benedictine Monastery, and you look in, and it's exactly the same people all over again, in rapt attention, all again nodding their head in agreement, which tells you, at least for those people, that they were on a search. The problem is that human history has proven that we are really great at searching and yet really bad at finding. Finding our heart's contentment, finding true joy, finding true purpose, and finding God. And I guess that's because God is so holy and other and different than us that it's hard to find God. God has to find us. Now, I'm not trying to deny that we come up with all kinds of images of God, assumptions about God. And yet what I'm trying to suggest is that these assumptions are always limited by our beliefs about what God must be like, or our projections about who God must be, or what our imaginations would say is even possible. And so it's good that our God is this one who comes to actually undo the wrong assumptions that we have about God. And yet in his coming, we get to find who God actually is. In the very beginning of John's gospel, the gospel that we just heard read to us, at the very start of that gospel, John declares, "The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light." It's a wonderful sentence. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. But what I want you to notice in that sentence is that we didn't turn on the light. We didn't discover the light. We didn't find the light. The light sought us out. The light shined into our dark world. And what John is saying here is that Jesus obviously is that light who is now shining in our dark world, and that we would have never known how to switch that on our own. This rather is a light that's seeking us out that we would otherwise have never found. And this light that is Jesus is a light that's finally showing us the way to God, the truth of God, even the very life of God, the way, the truth, the life. And yet, without God's turning on this light, the suggestion is we would all still be sitting in the dark. Now, you probably have put away your Christmas trees. If you haven't, it's time. But if you think back on the Christmas story, and the main players, Joseph, Mary, the shepherds, King Herod, also notice that not one of them were expecting all that took place to take place. Certainly not to take place in their lives. I mean, Mary and Joseph were perhaps hoping for God's light to someday shine into their very dark world, but clearly they were not expecting it to shine through their little lives. And so as the story's told, everyone in the story is shocked and surprised, sometimes dismayed, but universally feeling that something new has intruded upon them that they did not expect by these events. And what each and every one of them discovers in this process is this active God who is acting in ways they didn't expect, that they didn't even dream could be possible in their lives and for their world. This God who was meeting their deepest needs and dreams for what and who God could be, all of that except for Herod, who just wanted the world as it is. And as the story unfolds, we'll find out that he's not near alone in that. That's how you end up with a cross. But their lives, this active God that's acting in ways that they could not imagine is precisely the same God we meet up with today in that little town of Cana of Galilee as Jesus performs his first miracle, turning water into wine. What I want you to notice in this story is, again, nobody's expecting anything special to happen at this wedding. I mean, it's a wonderful wedding, perhaps, sure. But what's more ordinary in life, really, than people getting married? And even the wedding, you'd have to say, wasn't extraordinary, because in an extraordinary wedding, a very ordinary thing would never take place, running out of wine. And what's more ordinary in our world than running out? What's more ordinary in our world than scarcity? What's more ordinary than not having enough? What's more ordinary than the wine running out at a poor family's wedding? And yet here's an epiphany, a revelation, a light turning on in the dark. That particular wedding could never have been ordinary because Jesus showed up. Now, I've been to Cana of Galilee. You can actually buy wine at Cana of Galilee. Jesus' wine's described as really good. It hasn't lasted. I'll just say that. But what has lasted, they have these big stone water holders that are described in the lesson itself. And when you see them, you're just amazed by actually the size of that. And then you go back to the story and you realize something that you probably weren't paying a whole lot of attention to, which was just how much wine Jesus made. Did you notice it? It's 180 gallons of wine. 180 gallons of wine. Now, of course, nobody was looking for that. I'm not even really sure anybody really needs all that. And yet, with this sort of God that's come onto the scene, that's exactly what they got. And so all of their previous assumptions about what was possible in our world of scarcity, a world where the poor just have to have bad wedding parties, well, all of that, when Jesus came around, were immediately destroyed. And so again, Epiphany is this time of revelation. It's asking us the question, who is God? And where is God acting? And what this story says is surprise. It turns out that where God is acting is in even the everydayness of life. To turn on a light on even there. In order to make even the mundane little things of life into so much more, the epiphany is that ours is a God who doesn't like any darkness at all, who shines light into even the smallest places of darkness and want and need in our world. Now, I think that we are apt to have trouble with this water into wine story, not because we're so sophisticated and modern and above all, sort of miraculous story sort of as we like to think. Now, I actually think at least as much of our problem with this water into wine story is that we are overly constrained by our expectations of possibility. We live in a world of scarcity, and we think scarcity is all there can ever be. We don't look at the world through God's eyes of abundance. And so if wine comes along, well, you better steal the bottle for yourself and your family because there's not enough to share. And yet, if there's 180 gallons of wine, that sort of abundance, you don't have to hoard. You don't have to claim it as your own. You're able, finally, to share. And yet, we don't think that sort of world is a possibility. And so we discount the possibility of real change in our world. That the world could be anything other than a place where if I give of myself or what I have, that I'm going to be diminished. because of the scarcity that exists not only in the wine cellar, but truthfully, if we're not careful, in the human soul. And so we look at the world, and our assumption is that everything as it is now is exactly how it always must be. And so little wonder that even when we bring this into the realm of our spiritual life, we keep our prayers and our liturgies controlled and dignified, certainly respectful and respectable, but never, perhaps if we're not careful, really life-changing. Because there's nothing more easy than to assume a small God who really doesn't care to act in our lives and in our world. And yet, what I want you to take away from this today is the memory that we have a 180-gallon God. That's who our God is. And so we don't have to walk around this world being 8-ounce expectation people. 180-gallon God. Sure, on our own, when we throw a party, the wine runs out, the food burns, and as the story has it, none of it perhaps was the best anyway. It's just what we could come up with in our scarcity. But thank God that God doesn't condescend to our scarcity. And I want you to believe that He is coming into your life right now, seeking to turn on a light that says you don't have to live in that scarcity anymore either. Because God has enough and always shares. The two times that I was really shaken to my core in my visits to Haiti was the first time I ever went to Haiti and the time I went to Haiti in the months after the earthquake in Port-au-Prince. First time I went to Haiti, I just never seen anything like that. Certainly had seen poverty, been to poorer countries, but I'd never seen that sort of need. I've never seen children who were truly hungry and you weren't sure how they were going to get enough. I mean, in our world, I have fought all my life having too many calories. Have to get on dang elliptical machines all the time, battle that. And so it's dismaying to see the exact opposite of it. And all I could see everywhere I went was scarcity. And yet what blew my mind was that the people of Haiti, well, they have 180-gallon faith, somehow in the middle of that desperate need. And it really exposed my 8-ounce variety. How do they have 180-gallon faith with not near enough? Well, they look at the world and they see that there's more than enough in this world. And in fact, being with them, I learned this wonderful Haitian proverb. There's many of them that are great, but one of my favorites is, God gives, but God does not share. You'll have to think about that for a little bit. But the point is, God has given enough to the world. There's enough in our world. That's why I'm on that elliptical. There is enough. There is abundance. But God doesn't share. That's our job. It's our job not to live in scarcity when we have a 180-gallon abundant God. And so they look with expectation of what God might do for their lives. And when you're in a place like Haiti, in places and times of this real need, what you realize is that these stories of Scripture, of God providing enough for all, they're not merely nice morality tales or spiritualized sort of tales as we are like to have them, but that's really the hope that these people live with. It brings to mind, to me, that prayer we say at every morning prayer, if you ever do that liturgy, let not the hope of the poor be taken away. And I can testify it's not. I wonder why, with all that we have, so much of our hope is taken away. You know, we live with a lot of darkness in our world. There's a lot of darkness out there right now. And the temptation is to hoard. The temptation is to believe in scarcity. The temptation is to see life as a zero-sum game, and if I give of myself, if I give of what I have, that I will be diminished and smaller, and somebody's going to get more. But if you walk around life with an 8-ounce vision of yourself, you can't ever live into that proverb and share. But if you look at your life and the preciousness of your life and everything that God has given to you and realize that we have a 180-gallon God who has given of himself to us, then we don't have to be people of scarcity anymore. Yes, there is darkness in this world, which means it's precisely the time for this church and the people of God to not be people of small expectations or actions. In fact, now, in my estimation, is precisely the time to notice that it is precisely when our provisions fail, when our wine runs out, that Jesus steps in and life overflows. God has given. Will you share? We have a 180-gallon God. There's no reason for any of us to be 8-ounce people of faith. Amen.